goes here. So we finished off chapter 6 last time. We're on to chapter 7, which is the art of ancient Greece. We could say between the Mycenaeans, which were the last culture we went over in chapter 6, or civilization, there was a 400-year decline. It's a time period that had relative obscurity, and there's a bit of a migration of people into areas from other parts of Europe as well. And we're going to end up with a group of people in this part of the world. These are the Mycenaeans. That's what we're talking about. This decline, we looked at these sites. We're going to continue looking at this part of the world, but we're going to kind of talk a bit more of a group of people that called themselves the Hellenes, or the Greeks, that were split into two groupings. They had the tribal area and the city-state area over here. So the blue area is the Dorians, and the red area is the Ionians. They had an economy of maritime trade, agriculture, even though there was rocky terrain on many of these islands and things, and a manufacture of pottery and metal objects. So they were pretty well located in the middle of trade routes between, for example, Africa and Western Europe, and then Asia as well. So it was a good spot for trade. Then what happened is we had a Persian invasion that happened twice, once in 490 BC and again in 480 BC. So there was this Persian army that was trying to take over their territory. And this is when they had the beginning of a really strong, unified cultural identity. They defeated the Persians, and they thought of themselves after that as the best or most civilized people group or kingdom in the world. Um, they were also at that point a central point where emissaries would come from all over the world to Delphi to consult an oracle. So they thought of themselves as basically the awesomest. And anyone who wasn't Greek to them was a barbarian. Another part of their culture that was really important, and of course we all have heard of the Olympics, it stems out of their fact of measuring time in Olympiads, which were 4-year time spans. So they would have a celebration of their games, which we base our Olympic Games off now, every 4 years, and only the Greeks were part of it at this point. They would halt all wars between their city-states. Even if they were fighting with each other, they would stop and celebrate. The common citizens of Hella, the Hellenes, would come together, and they would really, really celebrate their Greekness, their identity as a people group. They reckoned time in this way, not by kings and dynasties, but in these 4-year periods, because they really very much thought about knowing themselves and the human form and self being really important. The individual and its psychology was of utmost importance to them. These are the type of city-states that would happen throughout the area. So we're not talking about one common kingdom with a giant king over the whole territory we're talking about in this slide. But we're talking about, even though they joined together, we're talking about a grouping of people that were together as a whole, and they would have their individual city-states and they totally abhorred, they hated the idea of having a king. So this was a big change from our earlier time periods where we're talking about periods of tyrants and things before this, or really, really strong monarchies. They began a type of republic that was, in certain ways, would be the foundation of later American democracy. It wasn't what we would say to be super awesome for everyone. It wasn't necessarily full of social justice, I guess I should say, because women and slaves were not included in the democracy, so it was not without its issues of equality. Another important part of their identity or cultural viewpoint, or the way they think about the world, was their pantheon, which is the whole widespread of their gods and goddesses, their pantheon of gods. Very complex, and they had people who were they had, I should say, entities that were gods or goddesses that were very much like humans. So they had a general idea that their idea was that there were an out of the earth, an offspring of earth and heaven, produced 12 titans. And then Cronus or Saturn, one of the 12 titans, uh, castrated his father to rule in his place, married his sister Rhea, and ate all their offspring. So you'll see sometime in art history there's Saturn eating his offspring. It's talking about this part of their mythology, so that they wouldn't be able to usurp his throne. So Rhea deceived Kronos so that Zeus here, would be able to live. So he grew into manhood in their mythology, and he forced Kronos to vomit up his siblings, so all the other of their kids, and they overthrew as a group together the Titans and ruled from Mount Olympus in Greece. These are their 12 principal gods featured most in the art. And this has some parallels into Near Eastern myth, and we could say maybe they borrowed some of those ideas from them. So the ones we'll see a lot are Zeus, Hera, who's his wife, Athena, goddess of war, wisdom, and cunning. They each have symbols associated with them. We'll see Poseidon quite a bit with his trident, and we'll see different versions of Ares, he god of war, armor, and helmet. So you're going to want to know about these. They're in your book. There's a whole section that talks about the pantheon of gods. So this is, a huge part of their worldview, how they see things. You could say in a way that they idealized the human person, their individual, to know thyself, that the man is the measure of all things in their society and their life. And that they made their gods like humans. So they were switching a lot of things on their head. And that would be something we would call humanism. There's all kinds of strange versions of, I should say, like subcategories where if a titan and a woman has a son or daughter, they're a god or goddess, and a god and a woman, they have a demigod. We get people in this like Hercules, and demigods and women have warriors. So there's a whole immortal family tree with all of the people, like Zeus and Leto have Apollo and Artemis, and Zeus with another wife has Hermes and Pan. So you'll see that it's really complex, different types of offspring, and they kept track of all this type of stuff. So a bit of a timeline on Greek art. There's the geometric age, 900 to 600 BC, the archaic age, which goes a little later, 600 to 480. Then the early to high classical, which is a shorter period of time, late classical to Hellenistic. So we don't talk too much about the geometric. We only look at a few pieces of pottery in the book. They had contact with Egypt for sure, and this is when the human figures started to appear in their work, albeit not super realistically. Then in the archaic, we begin to have life-size stone statues, and we begin to also have things that are emulating Egyptian sculpture to some extent, and the construction of their first stone temples. So we get the beginning of that type of stuff. When we get into the classical area, this is when we look at the Parthenon. This is when we have the Persian attack happening right here, and it revolutionized their sculpture. Began contrapposto, which we'll talk quite a bit about, with is the way that weight shifts inside of a figure, and their canon of proportions happen, that they're the size and shape of things in proportion to each other, like the Parthenon began to happen. After the war, we get a later war, the Peloponnesian War against Athens and Sparta, who won, and we get a bit more focus on things being real and a little less idealized, and the Corinthian capital appears. And then in the Hellenistic period, we get the death of Alexander the Great, and then up to Cleopatra until they became a roving province and they started to break the rules. So that's a really, really quick and maybe seemingly not totally understandable overview, but we'll go over it in more detail. I just want to give you a bit of an idea real quick. So I broke this lecture up by types of art rather than eras. So the first one we're going to go over is sculpture. When I mean types, I mean sculpture versus pottery and painting versus architecture. Quiros Boy is an interesting piece, and we can see how in this piece a lot of how they made gods like men and they made the ideal idea of a person or manhood. So this is a piece that they made to show an ideal of how men should be like the gods in quotation marks or a warrior ideal. This word Kyros right here means young man or youth, and it's from 600 BC. This is it from the side, so it's fully in the round as a sculpture all the way around it. You can see that it's fairly blocky still, and you could say that they learned quite a bit from the ancient Egyptians in their beginning sculpture. These were functional, actually. They were used as grave markers for young soldier. Proof of that would be found on the name that was inscribed on the bases. Very, very, very different idea of burial here than the Egyptians. They're not preserving the body from decay, but they're erecting these markers as memorials of people, not like an offering to them to be that there will be little gods each individually. So they're memorializing the human. It's carved marble, and it has a very overall Egyptian look to it. It's pretty rigid, very cubic feeling, still very rigid posture. We get the 1 foot forward effect like we had in ancient Egypt, but way more detail starting to happen than anything we've seen before this. It's very much idealized, showing an ideal and not bent knees, very straight, strict knees. This is the headband of the winning warrior or athlete. So this kind of talks to us about that idealization I'm talking about. Not a portrait. This is an ideal version of it, of manhood, not a portrait of somebody. So we'll go back real quick here to this one. It's a big difference here is nudity in Egypt would be you're like a slave. In Greece, it means you're a hero. It would have originally be painted, and this is maybe some of the irony of ancient Greek art is that people have developed an aesthetic, a look to things being like pure white marble or stone based on the way they found these objects, but they would have actually had them painted originally. This is very much what we talk about when we say, this would be a very good example, I should say, of idealism. When we're talking about a perfection of beauty, physical beauty, or also the representation that's idealized, how they think people should be. They have in this the idea that man is the measure of all things. But before we get there, I just want to show you this slide that shows that commonality between the Egyptian stance and the Greek. Albeit they cut away the extra stone, which they left here to kind of keep this from breaking. They've cut it away and it's fully in the round. It's not connected anymore, but it's very similar in its pose and its blockiness. And we could even say the Egyptian one feels a lot more realistic in certain ways. So they're showing an ideal of, they have an ideal in their philosophy, which is man is the measure of all things. And we're going to get to that in the next video. We'll pick up right here, but I want to keep this one short. So this is video 1. Video 2, Art 1, Chapter 7, video 2 will be next.